Just kind of jump in and get right into this. So the topic here loosely is scaled operations, and these are three of the companies that have done that, have scaled operations and are large businesses at this point. Maybe we'll start with Zach, closest to me. Like, what were some of the biggest challenges that you guys faced in, from inception through to the point of actually scaling and becoming larger? And I know uniquely in your case, you actually started as a different kind of business and made the transition. So maybe just illuminate that for us.
So yeah, we CleanSpark had its start. We were actually focused on renewables, and long story short, visited a data center in Georgia, and we saw the opportunity. Pandemic ended up being a great opportunity for me because we was really able to get the conversion and an orange pill my board over that time. And that became our focus. So we actually came in, we've since sold the energy business completely. So we are 100% focused on mining, but we do come with an energy first approach. So we came into Georgia, which has a grid that is market-based, but it lacks a lot of the other pieces that you're going to hear from these two panelists about the ancillary services and the demand response programs. They don't have any of it. What they do have is they have very abundant power. And if you can manage around that abundancy, there's incredible opportunities. So for us in that journey, it was all about scaling and testing things. So we started with our first data center and an expansion with air-cooled. We then wanted to do immersion. But we wanted to test it before we jumped all in. It was more expensive and a little bit unknown. I think all of us have learned a lot in the last while, but we built the immersion site. And then of course we took an opportunity in the bear market, and we've been very busy on the M&A side, really finding the diamond in the roughs, the sites that, maybe were imperfect, but with a little bit added to them have become some of our very best sites. So, and from there, it's been all about efficiency and uptime. So it's been a journey, but we really feel like bear markets are the time to build. And we've been busy doing that with, I think the last year we grew about 200% and last 14 months. And so it's been quite the journey. It's been great.
Excellent. Yeah.
Same
Jump right
question.
in.
Challenges.
Same question. Challenges, but also like what was kind of the unlock, if you can illuminate it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, listen, this industry is really nascent. And so on a spreadsheet, it looks like commodities E&P, and it's a really sexy business on a spreadsheet. And you look at it and you think, wow, those margins look fantastic. Translating that into a large scale operation, over the last couple of years, you saw sort of every type of challenge. Times moved really quickly, I guess, since the pandemic. But like when we launched, it was impossible to figure out how to book a ship to get things from Asia to the United States. Everything was overbooked. You couldn't get rigs quickly enough. Then the flip side of that happened. We had lots of bad actors in the space that, more broadly caused a lot of challenges, and rig prices plummeted. And then suddenly, debt financing blew up. And so every kind of imaginable challenge on the way to build scale really happened. I think, and these three companies are probably three of the best of the large folks in terms of their positioning, and there's some commonality. I think everyone on this panel, certainly I've looked at these guys, and has delivered the large scale things that they promised. And so, those challenges were myriad, but I think part of it is, just effectively delivering what you promised and then intelligently managing your balance sheet through a cycle. I mean, those are probably the biggest things you had to overcome.
Yeah. So Riot became a company at the end of 2017. At that point, I was just on the advisory board at the company's inception. And the company then was doing Bitcoin mining, but it was doing some other things as well. It was called Riot Blockchain, investing in an exchange, looking to launch a mining pool, looking to launch an exchange, all sorts of different kind of stuff. And that was an early time for Bitcoin companies in the public markets. And because of our timing, because of things that occurred in the past, we had a ton of challenges back then just getting the company onto a track forward. And when we finally resolved all of those issues, we narrowed in our focus on specifically Bitcoin and specifically Bitcoin mining. But in doing that and being one of the early companies, we really had to, in a way, pave the way on how mining companies do financial reporting, how mining companies operate as a SEC registered issuer, from how we're accounting these things, for how we're setting internal controls around these things, a lot of administrative things that we have had to navigate without any guidance. And that kind of leads to the other point. My other point of what has been a challenge is everything all of our companies are doing, it's new. There's not a playbook on how to do this. This industry is growing very fast. The thoughts and techniques around building infrastructure, on efficiently running operations, on managing power strategy, on doing all these things, we are all doing it for the first time and figuring out the optimal approach. And that takes... That is a huge challenge. There's no playbook to follow. You are with a group of people figuring it out for the first time. But in a way, I find that really rewarding because I think through doing that, we're able to build pretty incredible teams because they didn't come together into a perfect, tight, all button on top solution. They built the solution themselves. And I finished my thought with, I think what Tyler was saying was interesting. Like, there's so many things that can happen. And one of the things that we talk about as operating a company in the space is so much of what we do is dodging knives. Like, they just come from everywhere. One morning, getting a request for information from Senator Warren. Next morning, we're doing a 30% tax on mining. The next morning, the SEC is changing how we're handling impairment for Bitcoin. It's like it's always these knives are coming from every angle all the time. And positioning your company to have the staying power with the mindset of bad things are going to happen and we're going to be prepared for it is a challenge. But I think it's part of what's being part of what it means to be a successful large scale miner, particularly in the public markets.
You're kind of passionate about this, huh, Jason? A little bit?
This is all I do every day. Yeah.
This is a former poker pro over there. I feel like he's showing his hand here. You care. I love that. It's one of the things I love about a lot of the folks in mining is how much they actually really give a shit. It's awesome. And I think that's part of the formula of success, honestly, because if you're not bringing your creativity 24/7 to this, figuring out how to dodge knives, it ain't going to happen. Okay, so in this supposedly simple commodity business, you've got some inputs, you've got energy, and you've got ASICs. These things multiply and become super complicated. I wanted to talk about one of those inputs, just ASICs. And anybody can go first here, but do you guys worry about concentration among ASICs manufacturers? Maybe lead with that. And if so, what are some ways to kind of mitigate that concern?
Maybe I'll jump in. So, I think it's a concern in a very general sense. But if you look at electronics as they've developed as an industry, there's generally, 3 winners in every segment, whether it's your TV, whether it's your refrigerator, people aren't buying them from 15. So this is different because it carries a different value. That's the first thing to look at. But what really Bitcoin and the algorithm behind it is always driving for is efficiency. That's what halving forces us to do. Every 4 years, you got to look straight in that mirror and you got to think about efficiency. And so it's really created to reward those that can get there. And so I think that what we have is we have this market that's forcing efficiency more than other markets do. And so the ones that are going to be the best at keeping up with that, which, if you look at efficiency right now, there's really one clear winner, but there's really 2 others that are keeping, a close pace. I'm really excited to see the things that come from true innovation. We're still mining out of a shoebox, if you think about it. It's a shoebox with fans. It hasn't changed shape or size in a very long time. I think that when the form factor changes, when you get US companies involved, and there's some exciting things coming. But I'm a real believer that when those new companies come, they can't beat the next one in one thing or 2 things, meaning efficiency or total hash rate or price or terms. you need to really change the market. Somebody needs to show up that can beat in two ways, at least. It needs to be, pricing and efficiency. It needs to be terms and efficiency, all of these things, because we're so used to, as big miners, you have to buy a machine and wait sometimes months for it to show up. Somebody needs to disrupt the market in the way that these machines are sold and managed and moved. I think that that's where we're going to see the real change come. And I think that as soon as we're probably all going to reach a point as a market, we're going to think, well, now there's somebody that's clearly stood up and no one can catch up. And that's when somebody's going to really disrupt the market, just like it's always been in a lot of other industries. We're just waiting to see where that disruption comes from. So your question was really, am I worried? No, because I think that, human innovation is going to find the answer.
I'll jump in. I think, this is one of the scariest things in a lot of ways about being a CEO in this space, the dodging the knives. There's really three big one very big manufacturer of rigs, and then two that are also substantial. But one of them is on NASDAQ, so you have some transparency, but they're all Chinese companies, not necessarily tons of transparency into the background of the company and the financials, and they are your key counterparty vendor exposure. I'll tell you a story. When we went public, we raised $400 million in cash when we went public. And the first week I was the CEO I had been the CEO of the company, but as a public CEO, we had to wire $90 million to China. And so, and that's 6 months later, you hope the rigs show up. And by the way, the market, was soaring. And so here's a legal contract that, no lawyer worth their salt would say you should sign. And it's sort of take it or leave it. But you got in the business to buy the rigs from the folks that build the best rigs. And so, I kind of looked around and was like, who do I need to approve this wire? It's $90 million. And, people sort of looked at me like, it's you, boss. So, it was terrifying. And a lot of the white hairs on my head and beard came from waiting to make sure those rigs would show up, because you're dealing quite literally with people in a Telegram chat room, and you agree to send them hundreds of millions of dollars. So, am I worried? I'd say, look, now the good news is those companies have delivered. We at Cypher, we buy rigs from all three of them, Canaan, Bitmain, and MicroBT. And certainly after the pandemic, I personally made an effort to go to China, brought a translator, and met with the CEOs of the companies. I think that was a big part to try to get a better understanding of it. But, listen, this is in the same way there's knives on all the other elements of the business. Having key vendors that are Chinese companies is just an exposure. You don't know what's going to come from the administration in the United States. Is it harder to buy them? Do we have a new tariff? Does it somehow apply to other places? And does that break the economics of your business? Do your machines not show up for some reason? So, always want to keep a tab on people trying to innovate the next great chip. But the truth is, those companies are really good at building ASIC chips. And the ecosystem will evolve to different form factors and things like that. But look, it's one of the big risks in this business is how do you manage those counterparties? And we think about it all the time. It is definitely a risk.
Yeah, miners are the number one thing we buy. Not to go on a tangent, but what I tell people, one of the reasons that we're interested in immersion cooling is we want to make our biggest investment have the longest and most useful lifespan possible, and that's why we think the extra cost of immersion is worth that. But I just say that to emphasize the point on how important of an input these miners are. So yeah, there is competition in the space. I think how that is spread about is less important as that competition existing, and we found ourselves, I think, in a really interesting situation in the previous bull market, because while there were these other players, Bitmain really was leading with both efficiency, pricing, and supply. So you had all these companies coming into the public markets with, in a different macro environment, raising capital, and we were all trying to buy Bitmain machines. We're all trying to buy machines, and Bitmain was the one that could produce them. Now, very encouraged to see Canaan, MicroBT announcing new machines, more competitive pricing. Everyone's efficiency is getting down pretty low now. This is good for the industry. It's turning hash rate into more like a commodity and less like this rare thing that we're all fighting to take whatever terms. We'll just take it however we can get it. One thing that we're really excited about is seeing manufacturing of hash rates starting to come to the United States. Historically, a criticism of Bitcoin was how much mining was centralized in China. That was definitely true from a hash rate perspective. To me, I think an incredibly bullish milestone in Bitcoin's history is what happened in 2021. China banned mining, where 60-70% of hash rate was, and Bitcoin was unaffected. Like, that was always a risk. Brad Garlinghouse on CNBC talking about what a huge risk this is for Bitcoin and to go by Ripple. But look, it happened, and Bitcoin continued moving forward without issue. But the other side of that has been how much manufacturing and ownership of hash rate manufacturing has been in Asia. So with our recent order, we announced an order from MicroBT for about 33,000 machines, or 7.6 exahash, back in June, and we had additional purchase options with that agreement. We purchased these miners manufactured here in the United States. MicroBT has begun building a manufacturing capability here in Pennsylvania and other places. And we think this is really good, not only for Bitcoin mining, but for Bitcoin as a whole, because we're taking manufactured, of course, the chips are all still coming from the same part in Asia for now, but we're taking the manufacturing of the hash rate and not concentrating it so much in one location and bringing it out here where so many owners and operators of hash rate exist. So, kind of forgot what the original question was at this point, but yeah, just ranting about hash rate.
Love it. No, it's totally fine. And I want to move to the other major input, energy. And in particular, what I want to drill into is, it seems, looking from the outside, and using my noob mining brain, that there seem to be two winning models in the long term here. One is basically aligning as much as you can with the power provider and essentially kind of getting behind the meter and trying to make them look as much like equity partners as possible. And the other one is essentially playing in markets like Texas with a lot of demand response and curtail and being essentially a miner slash prop trading shop. And so I just kind of wanted to drill into those two models and also find out if I missed one. Is there another winning long-term model besides those two?
Well, I'll start. I think that Bitcoin mining is the tool that let's just say all generators or most all energy grids don't even know that they need yet. There's nothing like Bitcoin mining that has the flexibility, because blocks will come every 10 minutes. All the work we do is just as useful as the last block that was found, that has the flexibility and to use power when in demand or not in demand, and to use it at the capacity that there's that level of interruptibility, of flexibility, of control. There's no other energy load out there. So, I think Bitcoin is really interesting because, well, for a lot of reasons, but it forces you to think about so many things that you never thought about before. I think many people first get involved in Bitcoin and they start thinking about money and the legacy financial system and questioning things they never thought of before and took it for granted. And I think energy grids, energy markets, it's a similar thing as well, by extension through Bitcoin mining. You take for granted that we just have power in this room. Well, there's generation sources all over this state, that are operating sometimes, operating not sometimes. Demand is fluctuating, and a grid operator has the task of trying to match that supply and demand. So we operate in Texas in a deregulated energy market where there is ERCOT, which is tasked with the mandate of maintaining reliability of that grid, but it is a free energy market, a market where energy can be traded as well. And we think we are demonstrating the value of Bitcoin mining there by being a responsive load, not just by participating in ancillary services programs where the grid operator has the right to control our load, but responding to price signals to make capacity available. In that case, we're not just saying, hey, government or regulator, tell us exactly what to do. We are the market is telling us if there is insufficient supply or if there's a surplus of supply and power. So we're quite active in that, and that has been very effective for us over the summer to help drive ultimate net low cost per Bitcoin.
I'll pull on one thread there, and this is a complicated topic with a million nuances, and in some ways can be better discussed over an adult beverage. Maybe we'll do that later. But one thing I'll pull on just as a long-term view of how this industry interacts with the power generation industry, and this is really the vision for our company, is because of the unique nature of this business and what it can mean to grids as a unique user, large consumer of energy, but also at the times when others don't want to consume it. There's really an opportunity to optimize a balance of power generation and ultimately Bitcoin mining. And so, the key insight we had, for example, is that we also operate in Texas. Market prices, as probably everyone knows, vary wildly. They can go up 100x in a 5-minute block. And so if you look at a lot of the companies that do power generation, they make the lion's share of their revenue by capturing those peaks, right? Where they can make 100x revenue for doing the same work. Where this industry goes over time is optimizing the balance that the Bitcoin miner wants the power all the other times when there's not a peak. And so the two are very symbiotic commercially. I'm not even talking about the sort of public policy debate about strengthening grids and what that can mean to stabilize grids. I'm just talking purely commercially. The two sides are very symbiotic, and it's certainly our thesis that over time, there will be an upward integration of the Bitcoin mining industry, certainly the large scale folks, into the power generation industry. Today, that manifests itself via kind of clauses in contracts and PPAs and JVs and things like that. But over time, I think that only moves one direction towards greater integration.
Yeah, we actually operate differently, as I mentioned at the very beginning. So, over in Texas, they're in a deregulated market. We actually operate in a regulated market, and we're connected to the grid directly. But we chose Georgia specifically. So if you compare Texas, and this is something I think where Bitcoin mining thrives well. There's scarcity that impacts their grid from time to time, and then there's abundance from time to time, and it's due to the renewables coming off and on. We actually chose a different approach to operate in a state where the abundance is about a consistent base load backed by nuclear power. And so it's the only state that's still building, and they're also the 7th largest state for solar. So they have a very large base load, and then they do have intermittent renewables as part of it. Now, in those regulated markets, there's a unique structure that's set up due to actually a bankruptcy in the 70s where utilities broke apart. And we're actually almost 15% of the 2nd largest utilities load in the state of Georgia. And those providers directly own the nuclear power plants, and they funded those with bonds years ago. And they locked in their prices. And now there's small rural towns that are sitting here to benefit. When they bought those bonds, those towns had industry. They had carpet plants, they had other things. And what is there now? Bitcoin miners have been able to fill that role. So we have chosen a system that I think pairs really, really well, which is a system of abundant power and then using it in parallel with the grid. So we respond to one side of the equation, which is the market. We don't have the demand response side where there's ancillary services because we lack the signal that would come from a scarcity signal. That when there is some scarcity, it comes solely in the form of price. So we've been able to maintain very, very low prices, which helps us with our uptime. The part of the reason we chose that, having an energy background, is either, a business can be set up, a Bitcoin mining business, to really be that connection point to help balance a grid, or it can be set up in a structure that will help a grid grow. And that's what Georgia's doing. They are trying to continually outsize and be a net exporter of power. And we're there to stand there to help fund these bonds and to do future growth. And they're going to continue to push power outside the state. So very symbiotic. There's a lot more we could go down the rabbit hole on this. I see some signals on this that are telling me to move on, but let's yeah, like
Those
symbiotic
aren't for you.
relationships is what it is. I knew it was for you, but
It's
I
for
figured
me,
we
but
move
we
on.
started a little late. So I'm going to ask one more question. But the last question I wanted to ask you guys is actually about the current or future entry of nation states. And this could be actually, mining for themselves with fully government-owned facilities and teams, or it could be sort of de facto public-private partnership in nation states. And so basically, what's the lay of the land? There's rumors of some countries doing it now. Is that real? And then what do you expect, say a decade from now? Do you think that's going to be a big part of the landscape?
So we are seeing examples of that already, right? BitDeer had its announcement with Bhutan. Marathon's doing a deal with a sovereign wealth fund in the Middle East. So we're starting to see these deals come forward. I think that's a very bullish and positive sign for Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. I think an important reason that Bitcoin uses proof of work is that energy is an input that cannot be forged or stolen. And you can find pockets of very cheap power, let's say even state-owned power somewhere, but ultimately someone is paying for that. Energy always has to be paid for. And I think that because of that, I'm not concerned necessarily, this wasn't your question, but I'm not concerned about sovereigns getting an inordinate amount of control over Bitcoin because they have access to cheap power. Because I just do not think that happens at enough scale to be meaningful. Someone is always paying for it, right? So they're going to take that resource away from something else that is going to be costly to them. But I think that what we will see is the benefits of Bitcoin mining demonstrated, and we are going to see smart jurisdictions wanting to attract Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin companies. Obviously, we're already seeing that in El Salvador, and I think as more and more countries are getting smart about that, we're going to see more. I think it's going to be a positive thing, and I don't know if you guys know of anything else that's going on in that sphere.
I've talked to folks. There's definitely mining going on by sort of military states that have access to free power. Now, there's a cost to generate it, and they're stealing it or whatever those resources. But that definitely happens today. Some of the lower efficiency rigs go to places specifically that have access to free power. But on a kind of a longer time frame thinking, I agree it's bullish, but I also think it's inevitable. That doesn't mean next year, but to use the commodities kind of E&P analogy again, this is like drilling for oil, but in the 1880s. It's like a very fragmented market with a bunch of wildcatters and no one, it's nascent. The car hasn't been invented yet, so they haven't really figured out. We're using it to light lamps right now in the city, basically by analogy. And in the same way that today, huge nation states, drill for, produce oil. I think that's the path that ultimately that could take decades to migrate up that kind of chain from smaller countries that may have more of an incentive to do it earlier. But I think if you're a bull over the long term on Bitcoin in general, I think it's probably an inevitability.
Yeah, I'm with Jason. I think it's going to be in the form of partnerships more, but they're going to learn from those partnerships and they're going to set up shop. But I'm going to use the fear-based point. I don't really fear them having these big, massive deployments. If you think about the speed at which government moves, this is an industry I feel very confident that the commercial side, I'll call it, rather than government side, is going to be able to stay ahead. It is the old rigs that are, going to some of these places. The cutting edge is going to stay, in private hands rather than government hands. I really think so. So whether it comes or not, it's going to take a very long time.
Okay, this thing is working. Let's dive right in. We've only got 25 minutes and we got to answer the question to life, the universe, and everything. Is Bitcoin the answer? If so, what is the question? So that's what we're going to tackle in this panel. I'll just dive right in. I'll start the first question with you, Brandon. We're going to contemplate a few aspects of the future of Bitcoin. And although the rules of Bitcoin don't change, how we play at Bitcoin has been under constant change. Mining, for example, started on CPUs, it moved to GPUs, FPGUs, then little ASICs, then bigger ASICs, then industrial scale ASIC operations. And it now responds to issues like demand response and CO2 sequestering. How do you see the incentives of Bitcoin mining playing out well into the future, and how far do you care to speculate?
Absolutely. I think the first obvious thing here is that Bitcoin miners and energy infrastructure are going to merge together. They play a symbiotic relationship with each other, so I think it's good for the grid. It makes sense for miners seeking low-cost power. And I think the next thing for miners, let's say 10 years out roughly, I believe that almost no miners will be competitive unless they have an ancillary revenue stream. Maybe that's selling energy back to the grid in a demand response setting. Maybe it's capturing waste heat or any number of things that we haven't thought about yet. But I think that's mandatory, otherwise you won't be competitive. The second thing when I look far out in the future is more on the energy track. And I see Bitcoin miners playing a role in bootstrapping net new energy assets all around the globe. And the miners bring, essentially they're the buyer of first resort or the anchor tenant in a potential energy project. And that anchor tenant is the difference between getting an energy project off the ground or having it die on the vine. And so that's a very important thing because energy is the master commodity and all human flourishing, all industry is downstream of energy. And so more is better. And so the Bitcoin miners will produce more energy at a lower cost, more widely distributed across the planet. One cool example is a company called Gridless, who's solving the last mile energy problem in Africa. Essentially, the power producers, they can't bring power to the rural areas because it's not economical. So all the villages suffer without energy. Enter Gridless. They create microgrids, usually on remote hydro. And the Bitcoin miners purchase all that power from day one, so the energy investment makes sense. And simultaneous, the local people around that energy asset can acquire it at low cost. And it might not sound like much for people in this room, but having electricity after dark to charge your phone, to teach your daughter online, to just have enough cell phone minutes or power to call your family on Sunday, that matters to folks in that environment. So a little goes a long way there. And if we look far, far out in the future, if we play out that same incentive, I could see humans bootstrapping energy assets in the middle of nowhere. Let's say we drop a small modular nuclear reactor somewhere. And around that nuclear reactor, now that we have low-cost energy, you can build industry, you can have humans living around that. You can essentially build startup cities in territories that maybe aren't as popular around the world. And that'll give us an experimentation phase to try out new forms of government, new forms of human organization.
Did you want to add your thoughts on this, Pierre?
So I agree with a lot of that. I think that when I look back at when I first started learning about Bitcoin, I thought that Bitcoin mining would have to take up 51% of all the electricity in the world in order for Bitcoin to be secure. So I was, really wrong about that. I've been wrong about a lot of things. The next thing I was wrong about was I thought that transaction fees would have to go up, and that we need to limit the size of blocks in order for transaction fees to go up. And today, if we look at kind of the backlog of transactions waiting to get into the next block, there isn't that fee pressure that has materialized. Some say it will happen, but I think that the reason I was wrong about that prediction is because Bitcoin's technology, the Bitcoin protocol, is going to continue to have improvements that increase the efficiency with which we use Bitcoin. And so that will always be at odds with driving up transaction fees on Bitcoin. So now, updating kind of the prediction, I think that at the end of the day, it really is going to be about what is the value of Bitcoin. Today we measure that in dollar terms, but we can just think about it in terms of purchasing power relative to the rest of the economy. And that being on one side where we're pretty bullish, right? We think the value of Bitcoin is going to increase. On the other hand, for Bitcoin miners, every 4 years worth of blocks, every 210,000 blocks, there's a halving. And so their top line BTC revenue gets cut in half. So the key question is, what's going to matter more? Is it going to be the increase in value, or is it going to be the halving? I think in the medium term, the increase in Bitcoin's value is going to continue to outpace the halvings. And it has historically, and I think that'll continue in the medium term. I think in the long term, that will not be the case. Eventually, Bitcoin will reach some 100% adoption, however we want to define that. I think that we're pretty far from that today. I think we're at less than 1% adoption. And so when Bitcoin's at 100% adoption, its value is going to be increasing at the same pace as the overall growth of the economy in terms of its Bitcoin's purchasing power. And these halvings, the last halving will be in the year 2140, and 0 new Bitcoin will be getting added to the ledger. It'll purely be about the transaction fees. And if transaction fees are, continue to reflect kind of the steady state we've been in over the past 10 years of being low, not 0, but being low compared to what people's expectations might be, I think that that will actually represent a sizable Bitcoin mining industry. Because the purchasing power of that transaction fee revenue will still be substantial. So it raises a question of how should we be communicating about Bitcoin's impact on the energy sector, where in the medium term we do think that it's going to dramatically increase. But in the long term, it's not going to be 51% of all electricity use. And it's not going to be some kind of catastrophic ecological disaster that the critics really want to highlight. And we can balance that with the question about the security budget, but I'll let Vijay go next.
Yeah, I should say to start off that I'm not an expert in mining, but the thing I find absolutely fascinating is that Bitcoin is becoming critical to the energy grid. And in the places which have realized this, it is critical to the energy grid. I think the narrative on Bitcoin mining as being environmentally harmful is about to flip, and I think it'll flip big time, and I think it'll flip in the next year. It's not just because BlackRock is coming in. I think it's because Bitcoin is obviously good at doing something that if you care about emissions, you should care about, which is capturing flared gas. And I was speaking to the CEO of a small startup called Giga Energy, and they're going around capturing flared methane. And methane is incredibly harmful to the environment. It's 80 times more harmful than CO2. And with Bitcoin, you can now go capture that energy rather than flaring it, which the rate at which you're destroying the methane is much less than if you capture it for Bitcoin mining. So there is an underlying reality here that Bitcoin will be a tool for helping with emissions, and the narrative, just by the fact that these big companies are coming in and talking about Bitcoin as being helpful to the environment, is going to flip and match that underlying reality of miners are going out there and capturing these emissions so they're not going up into the atmosphere.
Yeah, it's amazing that we're already seeing the Bitcoin fixes this, Bitcoin fixing energy production, fixing the environmental consequences of energy production, that these aren't just memes, that they connect to reality. Let's get a little deeper then, as we go into the life of the universe and everything. A couple of days ago, there was a separate mining forum, and Max Kaiser had a few things to say about mining. And one of the things he said, which I found really interesting, he said, people buy gold because they're full of fear. People buy Bitcoin because they're full of faith. And Bitcoin seems to be drawing some kind of connection between faith, truth, and optimism. In something that allows you to verify essentially every single aspect of it, not requiring any trust, what is the role of faith in Bitcoin and among Bitcoiners? Pierre, why don't you dive into that first?
Yeah, so I think that first we tend to pit faith versus reason as kind of a dichotomy. And I think that's actually not the right dichotomy. I think that the dichotomy is really faith versus nihilism and apathy. And so I actually do think that faith and reason are simpatico. They go hand in hand. And that faith allows us to really, it guides us towards what we should be reasoning about. And even here today, the fact that we're all coming together to talk about Bitcoin, I think that speaks to the faith that people have in Bitcoin, in the sense that it brings folks together beyond just being a technology, being a financial investment. It really is perceived by the Bitcoin community as being a transformative power in the world for the good. And I think that fundamentally is about faith. And we can then, that gives us the motivation to want to understand Bitcoin and go down the rabbit hole. But ultimately, it starts with a firm belief that Bitcoin is good and that it's going to be good for civilization, for humanity as a whole.
Vijay, did you want to add something to this? And Brandon?
Yeah, I like what Pierre said, and I would say that there is not a dichotomy between faith and reason. I would say it's faith based in reason. And I would also say that this is slightly tangential, but Bitcoin and money in general is an intersubjective reality. It's something that has power only if we all believe it has power. But it's not like we just believe it for no reason. Bitcoin has these fundamental advantages as money. So we have faith in Bitcoin, but it's based in reason. And so I do think, I totally agree with Pierre that those two things can be strongly connected.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is if we look out in society today, I think we're at about a 90-year low in trust of our institutions. And so I think there's a premium on honesty and transparency. And Bitcoin obviously embodies those values. And so from a faith perspective, we're essentially shifting our faith away from a small group of old white guys in a room setting monetary policy and shifting that over to math, cryptography, and some sort of a public infrastructure protocol that is Bitcoin. And I think that gives us hope and optimism, especially for young people where it's severely lacking today. And as a species, we're best off when we're optimistic about the future, we're thinking long term, and we can invest in the future with large capital projects.
Great. Let's talk about freedom. We keep hearing that Bitcoin is freedom, or that Bitcoin can free us. What do you think freedom truly is? And beyond a superficial connection to being permissionless, how is Bitcoin really affecting our freedom? Vijay, do you want to talk about this?
So my view of freedom, I think, is based in the American tradition, and I think freedom is ultimately the freedom to escape. And the Puritans escaped the king, the Quakers escaped the Puritans, the Mormons escaped the Quakers. People always had the freedom in America to leave and find a place that matched their values. I think that's something that Bitcoin allows more than ever, is freedom to leave, because it gives you the power to take that which is most important in your life, which is the fruits of your labor, what you've built up over time through your hard work and the work of your family, and take it somewhere else if where you are doesn't match what you want in life. And I always think of the example of the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, who fled the Nazis across Europe and was almost caught by them, but without any of the savings he had built up as one of the great economists in Europe. And he landed in America with just the shirt on his back and had to restart his life as a lowly economist in a not very good university because he didn't have any choice. He didn't have the fruits of his labor that he had built up over time. And I think, what would it have been like if he had Bitcoin and he didn't need to worry about carrying his wealth? His wealth was in his head. He had like 12 words in his head, and he could find a new place and restart his life with the value that he had built up. So for me, freedom is ultimately the freedom to escape, to find the place that matches your values.
I think that along those lines, freedom is about having the free will to do good. And the converse of that in the fiat system is where you're coerced into doing bad. So what I mean by that is, for example, if you're holding dollars, you're indirectly financing a relentless war machine, a government whose policies are antithetical to human flourishing. And so in the fiat system, your time and energy and your wealth is channeled into doing things that are bad. Furthermore, with inflation, you're incentivized to engage in mindless consumerism because you need to drain your bank account before it's worthless. And so you're out there living paycheck to paycheck, just buying plastic junk and really filling your life with materialism, which is antithetical from my perspective to filling your life with good along more spiritual grounds. And furthermore, you're compelled into bad investments, whether it's real estate or junk bonds, et cetera, that you wouldn't have to do if you have a proper savings vehicle like Bitcoin. So I don't see freedom as an end in of itself, but it's a necessary part of doing good. And that's why I think that Bitcoin has tremendous moral value in that regard.
Yeah, piggybacking off that, I think Bitcoin, from a freedom perspective, to me means it's a universal property rights system for 8 billion people. It doesn't matter what country you're in, the capital controls, the regime. It doesn't matter how old you are, if you have an ID. It doesn't matter if you're a persona non grata or if your opinion doesn't fit the zeitgeist. You can contribute globally in commerce on a single economic language that everyone speaks and no one can prevent you from accessing. So from my perspective, it essentially brings human capital online that's currently stuck in an environment where they can't contribute globally, they don't have savings, they don't have a way to invest, or they can't bring their ideas to market. And so on the individual level, everyone's free to pursue their own economic interests. And at the species level, we're all going to benefit here because there's geniuses stuck right now under some authoritarian regime with an idea that will change the world, and they're not able to bring it to market. Imagine Mozart being born before the piano, how much we would lose from that. And I see Bitcoin doing the same thing for individuals today.
Nice. Hear it. All right, a question to start with you, Brandon. It's a common expression in the Bitcoin community that you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you. How does Bitcoin change people? And does the way Bitcoin change people ultimately change Bitcoin?
That's a deep one. So I think the adage is true. Bitcoin changes us way more than we change the system. But when I think about this question, it's changed me personally. Many other Bitcoiners can report that. But what I'm worried about is that simply just a reflection of us being the early adopters? Right? If we fast forward 20 years from now, are people going to go to a money conference people don't go to internet conferences anymore? So it's my belief actually that the more you invest in Bitcoin, the more you participate in this thing, the more it will change you. And so I think we're sort of in this honeymoon stage when it's radically changing us one by one. However, if we look in the long term, I think it will be a much more subtle change. Similar to the way that fiat money today, no one really notices it day to day. Why are we in a consumer society? Why are our morals eroding? Why are infrastructure eroding? The average person does not associate that with fiat money, and I think the same will be true in some future state if we're on a sound money or some sort of Bitcoin standard. We'll just think long term, we'll raise families, and we'll be a better version of our species. Now, will that allow us to then change Bitcoin? I don't think so. I think the primary value of this thing is that it's hard to change. And so it's not 21 million, it's none of these things. It's the fact that humans can't meddle with it. And historically, the reason why monies fail, either technological advancements or, more commonly, human greed takes over, print money because the barbarians are at the gate, and eventually trust erodes, the money's broken, and we move on. And so the fact that it can't be changed is fundamental here.
I think a big source of change that I've seen that I think is really related to Bitcoin's ability to dematerialize value. So we're able to store our value in 12 words or 24 words. And that just has never been the case throughout human history. Value has always been stored either in third-party institutions, right, or in physical assets like a plant, a factory, or in gold, right? And so being able to dematerialize value, I think that does have a transformative effect on people at a fundamental level, that now they no longer attach so much value to what they see, to this material reality, and they're able to perhaps access a layer of spirituality that was blocked off by the materialism before. And I do think that does change people tremendously.
I think Bitcoin has this ability to extend people's time horizon. I've seen this over and over again where people get into Bitcoin and they realize that there's only going to be 21 million of them, and their mindset goes from frittering away their savings by spending or investing in things because they're worried about inflation and their savings diminishing over time, to I want to get as much of this as possible. What can I put aside? What purchases do I not really need so I can get more Bitcoin? And it extends people's time horizon. The only thing I think extends people's time horizon as much as buying Bitcoin is having children. So I would encourage everyone to have as many children as you can. That will extend your thoughts about the future, because you want the world to be at a better place, and you'll be thinking about how do I produce a good life for my kids, and you'll put things away in the present so that they can benefit in the future. And Bitcoin has that same effect on people. I've seen it so many times.
I think we're probably down to our last question, just looking at the clock up here. So I'm going to ask, how far into the future do you think humanity will be using Bitcoin? Will it be a standard that lasts for 50 to 100 years like fiat? Will it be 500 to 2,000 years like gold? Or is it going to be something that lasts far, far longer?
I personally call the period that we live in right now the fiat money interregnum. It's the short historical anomaly, and it is an anomaly between two hard money periods of existence. The gold standard that existed, for thousands and thousands of years. This short fiat money interregnum, which is a horrible experiment that we're the guinea pigs of this experiment. And hopefully our children and our grandchildren will go back to a sound money standard. And enjoy that for the next 5,000 or more years.
I think forever. I mean, we can get into a cosmological argument of, is there going to be an end of time? But I think that ultimately Bitcoin's properties are such that they minimize uncertainty, and by being open source, if there's ever an opportunity to further minimize uncertainty, Bitcoin will certainly be able to adapt and integrate that. And so I do think that Bitcoin will, is kind of the long-term solution to the question of money, and then we can perhaps think about what different forms Bitcoin will take. If it's talking about Bitcoin in space, maybe we only have things like open dimes where you do actually have to physically move the private key rather than trying to broadcast the transaction back to Earth because you're too far from Earth. So those are interesting science fiction questions, but today, when we look at the fundamentals of the Bitcoin system and the software engineering, there's zero doubt in my mind that this can last forever.
Bullish. Satoshi had a quote, is something like, you can't solve political problems with cryptography, but hopefully Bitcoin will give us a leg up in the arms race of freedom and sovereignty against an encroaching state. And so in that sense, Satoshi sounds a little more bearish than all of us here, but he didn't have much purchase on how Bitcoin would react in the real world when he said that quote. So we're exceeding Satoshi's expectations. And I do think Bitcoin has a chance to be the first 5,000-year money, or maybe survive the heat death of the universe. We'll have to see. But I think the two reasons money fail, as I mentioned earlier, are technological advancements and human greed or co-option. And from the technology side, Bitcoin can integrate new technologies if absolutely necessary, right? That's kind of opposed to you can't change it, but if existential, we can upgrade Bitcoin as needed. And so that sort of solves any future technological advancements superseding Bitcoin. And then, like mentioned, you can't change this thing, so it's essentially out of the reach of humans. We can't trust ourselves with the money printer, so Satoshi took it out of our hands in the same way that Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it back to the people. Satoshi stole money out of the central bankers and gave it back to the people.
I think that about wraps up our time. So I want to thank you guys for all your thoughts here today and all the thoughts you continue to put into the Bitcoin ecosystem as we go forward and discover whether or not Bitcoin is indeed the answer to life, the universe, and everything. To everyone in the audience, there's an amazing presentation coming up. I know everyone on this panel wants to get into the audience to see what's up next, so stay tuned. Thank you.